Thank you. You can applaud. Yeah, that's fine. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, how's it going? My name is John. I make art, and I'm also a teacher. I'm the Kenneth E. Hudson Professor of Art at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. I have to say that to every student I ever meet. It's extremely long. But I'm the chair of a program called Illustration and Visual Culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about the visual culture of Scripture tonight and some of the challenges there. But first, a little about me. I really like to draw. I've been drawing as long as I can remember, basically. This is me. This is not sped up. This is how fast I work. That's how I get so much done. No, but you just have to spend so much time when you make art, right? You're looking at the stuff for so long. It's something people don't really appreciate. You know, you look at a piece and you absorb it, and honestly, if you stare at a piece of art for 30 seconds, you're probably a little unique. Most people absorb art pretty quickly, but it takes a long time to make. And I have made lots of books in my career. I've made two that retell the stories of Jesus, and we're going to get into that a little bit tonight. But one was called Miracle Man, another one called Go and Do Likewise, a retelling of Jesus's parables, or at least some of them. And then I've also done graphic novels. This is a book called The Myth Makers, which is about two gentlemen, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. You probably know them and their stories. This is a book where there's just these two characters I chose at random, a lion and a wizard. And they sort of move through this adventure of exploring what a myth is. And eventually they explore the myth of Tolkien and Lewis themselves. And so part of this book, the conceit was, we've seen illustrated versions of Narnia and Middle-earth a gazillion times, but we have never really seen an illustrated story of the Inklings. So that's might be a book that you're interested in, and now you can read the whole thing in 10 seconds. It took a while. These books take a long time. Like I said, this one took 5 years. I hope you think it's worth it, but if not, let me know. I can give you a refund. All right, let's read some comics together. Whoa. Oh, I love all your artwork. Well, I hate them. Derivative, uninspired, fraudulent, well-crafted, but unremarkable. I may have okay ideas, but they're never great. Oh, well, why do you keep making so many? Well, I guess not making them is slightly worse than hating them. Incarnation is always painful. Okay, so we know that the very first thing we learn about God is the fifth word in the Bible. What's the first thing we learn about God? In the beginning, God. Yes, right. He's a creator. He likes to create things. He created man in his image, and we have been returning the favor ever since. And this is part of the challenge and really interesting part that goes into thinking about a visual theology. Okay, now we're actually not going to get into much literal theology, but the first thing I want to say is actually I'm not a scholar in this area. I'm an artist that thinks about this stuff, so I'm not sure I have any really good answers, but I hope this can be a way for you to think about some of these things in a new way. So let's just for a moment think about all the stuff that goes into just some of the most basic decisions when we visualize Scripture. There's adaptation. There's visual metaphor, there's translation, there's depiction. And this all actually goes by very quickly. Like I said, when someone looks at a piece of art, you're probably not considering much of that, right? Like, there's a literal painting of Jesus behind me. Hey, did you look at it? Did you notice anything interesting about it? Maybe. You've seen probably a lot of images of Jesus that look like that, right? That, the very fact that maybe you didn't notice anything about that is interesting in and of itself. Because when I say this term, okay? What does that mean to you? Like, if you were to imagine a piece of Christian art, what does that mean? Is that this? Well, it might be the Sistine Chapel, right? That's a pretty good one. That's a check plus right there. Or David, again, big fan of David. I think Michelangelo, bang up job on all this Christian art. But what gets interesting is that, come in, we're talking about images of Jesus. What gets interesting about this is Christian art can mean a lot of different things. Now, okay, I'm going to show you some things today, and I've given this talk many times. I have never shown this and not had the response of laughter, because there is something almost absurd about it, okay? But what I want us to examine is the difference in the goals of some of this art. Because in many cases, these are genuine saints, people who are of faith, who are trying to make images that capture the unexpressible, that capture the feelings of faith. And they are absolutely sincere in doing that, right? So in some ways, I don't want us to laugh at them. I want us to look at it and try to understand what it is. So when I say images of Jesus, what's the first thing you think about? There's some classics out there. This one certainly is one I think of. There's another one that's very famous. These are things that we think of when we say images of Christ. But in an American context, I bet one of the images you might think of is this one. This one has been reproduced probably more times than the Sistine Chapel. And the country church I went to with my grandmother as a child, she lived in a very small town in Missouri, they had one of these right above the altar. And this was painted by Warner Salmon. So as we uncover this, you start to very quickly figure out there are some interesting problems with depicting Jesus. Now, for instance, let's go back to this one. This is this painting Undefeated by Stephen Sawyer, and he did several that we're going to look at. It today, in our modern visual culture, when we look at this, in some ways we see it alongside other pieces of visual culture, like the proliferation of AI. Okay, I don't know if you've seen that recently. I'm fascinated by this. So these two things are sitting side by side in our brain, right? One is an absolutely sincere expression of a person of faith trying to convey that. Another one is a piece of absurdist pop culture that is not meant to be sincere at all. And these two things are sitting together in the way that we look at them. And so we have to know, as if you are a maker, that is what's going on into the mind of people when they look at images of Jesus, no matter what your intentions might be. So when we take these famous images and clearly an artist thought this was good, but what would be better is if Jesus was actually not looking away from you, but looking at you. There's a weird dissonance that happens in some of these. This image on the left, I thought this was Michael W. Smith growing up. This was in my youth group. I have very fond memories of this image. It's just so 70s Jesus movement, Jesus. The other image, often called the bearded lady Jesus, where Jesus has very feminine features, but then suddenly a sort of beard glued onto the face. This is one you may have seen quite a bit, another one from Warner Salmon, Christ at Heart's Door. And again, if you do a Google search of images of Christ, most of the ones you see, at least in the top, are not Caravaggio, right? They are these 20th century evangelical expressions of Jesus who always seems to look a particular way. Jesus knocking at the door. For some reason, Stephen Sawyer went on to do another version of this, the Nazarene filters. And again, this starts to, again, as we examine what these are doing, these start to veer into the world of kitsch. And this is a whole nother category of what visual culture might be doing to us, right? There's high art, things that would go in a museum. There's popular art that would be like visual culture and comics and stuff that is important but is not in a museum. And then there's stuff that's like everyday culture, which of course is still visual culture, but falls into this category of kitsch. Now, the more you start clicking through these images, the more it's hard to see, like, is this AI? Is this kitsch? Is this an expression of someone's sincere belief? If you've been around church culture for long, you probably know about the chick tracts. These were very famous comics that were made as part of the sort of underground comic movement in the 60s and 70s, and they were sort of left at bus stations and were meant to be evangelical in nature. But of course, the nature of the way Jack Chick depicted the sort of consequences of not believing Christ made them almost read like horror comics. They were a very sort of visceral experience when you read them. And again, I am fascinated by these because I don't even understand what this image is, actually. If you try to say that Jesus is substituting himself for your suffering, I think that's a really good image. But if I was an art director, I would say, I don't think Jesus is going to take heroin for you, for example. And then sometimes these expressions, which are genuine, fall into actually sort of like blasphemous territory. I think the goal of this is to express, if I could just break it down conceptually, that Jesus was so strong that the cross could not break him. And that's visually what's being depicted. But unfortunately, the theologically, at least in the Christian tradition, the Protestant tradition, the cross did break Jesus. That was the whole point. And that death was defeated on Easter, not on Good Friday, right? So there's all these confusing things that happen when we make images that try to express the unexpressible. I did this talk recently, and I got sent this after the talk from somebody that was there. It was like, I saw that one on a billboard. And again, these things are, if you really start to dig and look at them, they're really endless. And I was just telling Maddie earlier, my dream project when I'm 85 years old is to do a definitive encyclopedia of 20th century evangelical art. So, look for my Kickstarter. This one I just saw on TikTok this week. If you can't read that, when your family points out at a funeral that the Jesus statue on the wall looks exactly like Travis Kelce. Uncanny, right? Okay, so we're still in the kitsch category right now. Because if you think like I'm trying to say kitsch is bad, art is good, I just want to propose this little problem, which personally, in my mind, the Jesus nightlight has done more to comfort scared children in the middle of the night than the Sistine Chapel ever could, right? And so there is something mysterious at play when we evoke the image of Christ, even in a $2.99 nightlight. So I think there is a certain humility you have to sort of place in front of all of these things that we think about art, right? There's no easy answers here. There's also a challenge of our own cultural modesty when it comes to how we depict Christ. If you, for instance, depict the crucifixion, for instance, we've almost always seen the crucifixion depicted one particular way. You might actually imagine that the way crucifixion was done was they always put people in a loincloth. This image is from the St. Louis Art Museum. It's not on display currently, but That's one you could see in our neck of the woods. But of course, that's not what the Romans did. The point of crucifixion was maximum humiliation. So I am going to show a nude image of Christ. If that's something you don't want to see, you don't have to look, but it's tasteful. But it's done by Edward Nippers, and it's someone who is attempting to actually depict crucifixion as it was seen by the people who saw it, right? And this is very interesting as a challenge to what we normally see. And again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I don't necessarily want images of a naked Jesus on crucifixions in front of church services, right? But what I am saying is that those images have formed something in your mind that has created meaning. And that's a powerful thing to examine. It's also very interesting what we think of as a modern approach to depicting Christ versus what we think of as an accurate or ancient portrayal of Jesus. When you look at this, I think they're attempting to depict him as he might have looked then, maybe. Other than the skin color's probably not right. He definitely was not wearing satin at the time. I don't think the trees are right. The rocks definitely probably could be there. But again, right, what are the goals of this image when we look at it? It's very interesting. If I was to show you this, this is an image of the Annunciation. When do you think this might have been painted? It's really an interesting depiction of what the Annunciation, the angel telling Mary she was going to have the Messiah. And this was not painted this year or last year. This was painted in 1898, right? This is, to me, strikes me as a very modern depiction of this event. And it was painted by an African-American painter who, in his own time, depicted many interesting Bible scenes. So if this is interesting to you, go look up Henry Tanner. But from contrasting that to something like Jesus appearing at a business meeting, or Jesus, this is the UN building. This is Jesus knocking on the UN. What do you think he's doing? What is he saying? Is he saying, I mean, legitimately, I don't know. Is he saying, like, let me in? Is he saying, you're in trouble? I'm watching you? Again, this is a very sincere depiction by Harry Anderson, who we're going to see some more images from him, or we have actually earlier. But of course, as modern people, you cannot help but, when you see a giant person outside of a building, it looks like a kaiju, right? And so there is an absurdity that we can't really, I think, approach the subject matter as it is, or at least as the artist intended it to be. But the Jesus in front of the UN building is often in thrift stores. So, I mean, there were millions of that image printed. And then, of course, we have the beautiful work that's on display across the street, which I had never seen in person until tonight. And the thing that's so striking about it is the scale. One of it's it's much bigger than you imagine, I think, if you'd seen the images beforehand. But I love Mr. Hodgell's work. One, because it's really pushing some of the design language inside of what a piece of art could be, but also really challenging how those things are depicted. This is one of the most famous images of Jesus, and we see repeated over and over in art history. Again, I'm not a scholar. I'm just doing this based on what I've seen across lots of work that I've looked at. Is these shapes that are in this particular painting of Christ often are echoed in lots of pieces of artwork, and some believe that maybe that's connected to the Shroud of Turin, which is a sort of semi-apocryphal shroud that may have been over Christ. It's very unclear if it's a forgery, if it is an actual artifact, if it is legitimately the burial shroud of Christ, but it has this imprint on it that scientists don't exactly know how it got there. And those shapes and those features, the owlish eye, the sunken owlish eyes, the long nose, are repeated through a lot of medieval art. So, was one of them first, or was the Shroud of Turin, mimicking these other images, we may never know. One of the interesting conversations that this kind of quickly brings up, though, is the question of, is there a correct way to depict Jesus? This is another image by Stephen Sawyer, and I think in our world, in 21st century Western Christianity, I think it is very easy to criticize images that depict Jesus like a white guy, right? We tend to think that's not really what he looked like. Maybe that's a very flawed, maybe even harmful way to depict him. I've certainly heard that, and I think actually there could be a strong argument for that. But I think another thing to think about as we walk into this way to think about how you depict Christ is that the history of depicting the undepictable, which is the story, the Christian story, has often been for each culture to imagine Christ in their own place, in their own time. And there is a long history of this. So I don't think that is an incorrect notion, right? To sort of reclaim the Christ story as imaged in every man and woman and child on earth. So like you say, like very quickly when you start pulling the thread on this argument, there's not a lot of easy answers. Because then there are paintings that depict Christ as, say, an African American or a black man that make a political statement, right? That are intentionally provocative. So there are things beyond just, am I doing something accurately? Like, I don't think that painting is aspired to be accurate, right? It's aspiring to tell a story, a very particular story. Okay, let's take a small time out of looking at these, and let's go to art school for a couple minutes. Can we do that? Would you like to go to art school? Okay. You don't have to go to graduate school. Some of my former students are here. I'm sorry. You should have just come to this lecture. So it's important to remember that drawing is actually just thinking made visible. Okay, I'm going to say that another way. I think everything in the world begins with images. We are images, right? We're walking images. And I have a good friend to back me up. Mr. C.S. Lewis said everything began with images. Actually, he was talking about, in this case, his own process. His own process in storytelling was he saw an image of a fawn in the woods carrying a package under a lamppost, and it was snowing. And like, what is that story? He didn't know. He had to write to figure it out. And so I think God gives us images because we are images. And so thinking about drawing as a tool to imagine something that is possible, not just as a result-generating machine like AI, is a good way to think about what drawing can be in your life. I draw all the time. This is my sketchbook. This was me drawing at Mr. C.S. Lewis's house a few years ago. And to that end, it's important to remember that drawing is a process, almost more than it's a result, believe it or not. You tend to think I'm going to draw to get an outcome. But what I'd like you to consider in this is that drawing itself, the time you spend doing it, is important and might be the reason to do it. In his wonderful book, The Supper of the Lamb, which is a cookbook, but it's actually about making art, R.F. Capon says this: interest in results will never conquer boredom with process. So for me, the way I do that is I draw in my sketchbook. This is me drawing in church. I love drawing in church. I recommend it for everyone. Personally, I think I have a hard time paying attention to people speaking. And I really compliment all of you for making really good eye contact while I'm doing this. I tend to watch the person talk and then drift away. But if my hand is moving, I can pay attention easier. And so in my sketchbook, I draw, people, I draw disasters, all sorts of things that just to me, if my hand is moving, like my brain is working, right? Images and thinking are connected to me. And this brings up a very provocative notion. Can drawing itself, if the process of drawing is maybe the reason you do it, can that thing itself be a form of worship? Let's think about that. I certainly use my sketchbooks as extended meditation on what the preacher is saying. And I try to treat it almost like a game. I just listen to what they're saying, and I just start drawing. Sometimes it's writing a quote. Sometimes it's just doodling some things that I want to make, and then connecting them later in the talk. And also, this is cheating. I'm showing you all my favorite ones I've done over the last 20 years of doing this regularly. So again, most of the ones that I do never end up in a talk. So this just makes it look like every time I sit down, I do a great drawing, but that's not really true. But one of the great things about when you're an illustrator, sometimes you need activities that remind you you're not just a hired hand, you're not just on a deadline for the publisher, but you like making stuff just for yourself. And so for me, drawing in my sketchbook is always that thing that just really connects me to the love of the craft. The time that I spend doing it, to me, is valuable, whether or not the drawing works at the end. This was a famous phrase from my former pastor, Kurt Lutchins, who died a few years ago, but he always told his children before they left the house, always remember who is in your boat. And I just think about that all the time. Okay, so there's a lot of these. Again, someday maybe I'll collect them in a book. Here's the problem, nobody wants them. The problem is my images are like this are too weird for church publishers, and they're too churchy for religious publishers. Or for secular publishers. I had Fantagraphics was very interested in publishing my sketchbooks a few years ago, and they loved how they looked, and they're like, yeah, this is interesting. And then as we got further in the contract, they said, hang on, I just was looking at some of these a little more closely. It appears that this is all very sincere. And I was like, I didn't even think I needed to say I sincerely believe this. But they were like, we kind of thought it was more like, having a go at the church. And I said, well, that's not what it is. And they're like, we pass. Okay. The Saint Wendell said this: the significance and ultimately the quality of the work we do is determined by our understanding of the story in which we are taking part. So that little story about Fantagraphics just confirms that you have to make a choice. You can only be one of these, right? No, that's not true. Actually, this was a very urgent question to me in the 90s. Like, in the age of cultural relevancy and cultural engagement, when it was considered crazy for an artist to go and make work in a secular context who was Christian, like not make pictures of Jesus. It really took this question, what kind of art can a Christian make, into what kind of art must we make? Right? What is the requirement? If you are a faithful believer, you are wasting your gift if you are not drawing, Jesus praying on a rock every day. So I want to talk just for a few minutes. We only have 2 more hours to go in this lecture. Just about some of the things I learned from depicting Jesus myself. I have 2 books about Jesus. There he is from Miracle Man and Go and Do Likewise. He's always followed by butterflies for some reason. But this book really began with inspiration from the good old-fashioned red-lettered Bible. I remember the first time vividly I saw a red-lettered Bible. I couldn't believe it. The church I grew up in just had black and white Bibles. The fact that Jesus got his own color was so exciting to me. I'm like, this guy must be important. He gets red all to himself. So in this book, I wanted to take the idea that what if every time Jesus spoke, his words transformed into pieces of the architecture, pieces of the landscape. They sort of activated into physical type that the characters had to walk through. In this case, Jesus is turning birds into words. Or maybe snakes are flying through the air. And also, this was a very last-minute addition to this book, was every time Jesus walks through the land of Israel, little flowers pop up under his feet. And it was almost a lark that I did. And it's become the signature thing that everyone loves about this book. It's so funny, and I feel like I can hardly take any credit for it. But all the tattoos that people have from the book, from Miracle Man, have the flower feet. So I approve of that. You can get a tattoo if you want. It was a long process. I grew a very long beard during the time I was making this to sort of method illustrate. It was not a great look for me, but it did make me more connected to the problem of how you depict Jesus. But it was also a challenge on another level, and that's this weird problem when you get into the Bible about metaphor. I think it's very easy for us to understand the Bible in certain ways. Like, for instance, you can't have facts without truth, but you can have truth without facts. Whoa, okay, all right, hold on, don't throw anything at me. What I'm saying is a poem about the beauty of a rose bush, is that a documentary? No, not really. Is that a scientific document? No. There is truth in a poem that actually can't be found in a scientific description of that same rose bush, right? There is the sublime. There is some interpretation that happens. And in that space of interpretation is where the meaning comes from. And in this book, I took some liberties in that sense, in the telling of the story of Jesus. And a lot of people were not happy about that. And I actually understand why people would be upset in some ways. Because, well, a weird thing that people do when you make books about Christian themes is that you imagine that the great big liberal masses that are looking for Christian content and hoping to cancel it, that never really happens. The only complaints I ever get about my work are from other Christians, which tells you something. But in this case, a common complaint that I got, and I think I'm explaining this because I think it's worth unpacking, is that in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, I depicted Jesus getting his lunch handed to him from a little girl instead of a little boy. And many people seem to believe that I changed that out of some sort of political agenda. And the facts are that I changed that because I had in the book at one point the story of Lazarus, which is my favorite story in the Gospels. Mostly because it has Mary and Martha's interaction with Jesus, which I just love. And we had to cut that to get the Last Supper in. The Last Supper was not originally in the story. And it just broke my heart that a little kid, a girl, could read this book and not see herself somewhere interacting with Jesus. So I turned the boy into a girl. Now, what's interesting about that is people often complain that I am changing scripture in that case. I think that's an interesting argument, and I'm sympathetic to it. But the one thing that they never talk about is that there are also flying snakes in this book. I never get letters about that. I never get letters about Jesus' words turning into buildings or flowers popping out of the ground wherever he stepped. I get letters about this very particular change in the gender in a story in the Bible that I might remind you, there are 6 accounts of Jesus feeding the masses. In one of those accounts, we hear of a boy with his lunch. So there's 5 others without that. If we're going to look at the Gospels and say, well, on par, there's all this over here that the boy wasn't there. There's only one that the boy was there. Does that mean the boy didn't exist? No, I don't think so. Because there can be truth without facts, even in the Gospels. Even when you read the Gospels, you have to do some metaphorical work in your brain, because there are 4 accounts that are not a documentary. And this is why we need art. There are some truths that are so big they can only be told in the form of mythology. And I don't mean mythology as a lie, but I mean mythology as art making. In fact, in my book, Retelling the Parables of Jesus, I ran into this almost immediately. First of all, it is a terrible idea to start with the problem. You know what? Jesus' stories, they weren't good enough. I'm going to punch them up a little bit. I'm going to retell Jesus' stories, but make them, like snappier. Very difficult to do. He was a good storyteller. In fact, I got a review from this book on my Goodreads. Don't ever go to my Goodreads account. Too much fairy tale, too little gospel. And honestly, I want to put that on the back of the book as a... So, an artist's goal, I think, like for me, in retelling these two stories, is never to replace the Bible. And that's what I tell people when they email me and they have a problem. I'm like, I'm not telling you to not read the Bible. I'm saying this is a poem. This is something that adds, enhances, and finds that space that's often not there when we read the word itself. And again, am I telling lies or are those metaphors? We'll do a show of hands. Everyone for lies? So, this was just formally, I really love this piece I did about Lazarus. This takes a June Carter Cash song, Will You Miss Me When I'm Gone, and sinks the story of Lazarus inside of that letter form. And I love that trick because it makes people stop reading first. Usually when you see words and images together, people read first, then look at the picture. And I like flipping that. So I did a lot of that in this book. And here's how I do my process for those nerds out there. I like to do sketches in pen. That way I'm not erasing. I'm not worried about bad drawings. Do a lot of doodles. Then I pick a few to sort of like clean up and make a little nicer looking. Here's a few color comps. A nice tight sketch, and then there's the finished drawing, which is on a piece of 4-ply vellum Bristol, and then I put fluid acrylics over it, and then I scan it and do some digital trickery on it. So this project was really fun for a lot of reasons, but one of the stories I like to tell about this is my editor, who I've worked with at Abrams Books. It's very important to say that I don't work for a Christian publisher. I publish at Abrams, which is a secular publishing house. And my editor is not a Christian. And in many ways, he's been the perfect editor for me. For the last 19 years, I've written for Howard, and I love him. I love his advice. And when we started out with this concept of the book, he said, "Oh yeah, a book about the parables, that's great." And I said, "Well, I've sent you a draft, 12 parables, right? Kind of a good number, Disciples, all that stuff, tribes of Israel." He's like, "I don't know what that means." 12 parables. What? And he loved it. He's like, "What if we do all the parables?" And I said, "Well, there's like 80, depending on how you count, and a lot of them are about hell." And he's like, "Let's not do that." But then he said, where's all the blessed is the meek stuff? I'm like, "Well, that's the Beatitudes." He's like, "Well, that's one of his greatest hits. That's got to be in there." So I have a few pages that use some of Jesus' teachings alongside his parables. But the story I want to tell about Howard was when he first read The Prodigal Son, my retelling of The Prodigal Son, he didn't like it. And not because he didn't like my retelling, he didn't like the story. He thought it was a bad story. He's like, "Tell me what I'm supposed to learn from this, because I'm with the older son." Like, the young son is a jerk. He blows all of his money, he just leaves, he wastes everything, and then he comes home and he gets the biggest party in the world. And he's like, "I would be so mad as the son." And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't seem fair that the younger son gets so much grace, right? He's like, "Yeah, it doesn't seem fair at all." And I said, "What do you think the older son did? Did he come into the party or not?" And of course, we don't know. Jesus leaves that at the end of the story. We don't know if the older son decides to celebrate with the father and the son again. And in some ways, that's the point of the parable. It's sort of inviting you in and saying, "Oh, you are the ungrateful person reading this parable, just like my editor." So, yeah, it was great. It was great to sort of like, oh, I bet this is what Jesus felt like. Some lost sheep. I don't think I would ever get a tattoo of my own work on my body, but if I did, it would definitely be this sheep that's somehow gotten himself stuck in the top of the bush. You know, he seems so pleased with himself, too. The redesign of Christianity Today, I would really recommend if you want to support art and artists. CT has done a lot in the last year to really highlight and use original art. And one of the things I got to do in their first issue in the redesign was they have this back page that they just give to an artist. They give them one scripture reference and just let them make an image. And it's really, I love how this one came out. Back to art school, and maybe how you might engage some of this in your own practice, is that illustration can also be kind of treated as a game of improv. And my book, Drawing is Magic, is actually the reason I did this was I hated drawing books as a kid that just taught me how to draw like a horse or Spider-Man or whatever. I wanted a book that taught me how to write stories and build ideas, and that's why this book exists. But has anyone done improv? What's the number one rule in improv? What do you say? Yes, and yes, that just means like whatever you get, you accept. And I think that's a good way to start if you're drawing in a sketchbook. Don't veto anything, don't plan anything out, just pen to paper. Because most people actually imagine that the way artists work is they have a good idea, then they put it onto the paper, and from my experience, it's the other way around. Once your hand is moving, once you're making something, the act of making, the somatic feeling of making art creates ideas in your mind, which is why this book is coming out next year. Oh, go buy that. 100 Things You Love to Draw, Abrams Books. So again, I do treat my sketchbook as a form of improv, and you know, I don't bring my paints to the service. Like, I'm not like a psychopath. I don't have an entire like easel set up. Actually, if I was here, I could take a whole pew probably, but I do it on Sunday afternoons, and it's something I look forward to every week. Yeah, there's lots of these. One of the great things about drawing too in a church is that people began to notice that you draw in the church. And recently a wonderful brother or saint in our church came up to me and said, you know what we should do? We should put a camera right on your sketchbook. And then we project it in front of the congregation while the pastor is preaching, and everyone could watch it happen live. And I said, that is definitely not how it works. I don't think that would be a great idea. Okay, last section, and then we'll stop for some questions. There's also a problem in Scripture of depicting things that are literally undepictable. In this case, what does the Holy Ghost look like? And I've answered that question. I have a book called The Holy Ghost, and I'll tell you what he does. He hangs out with a squirrel and a badger, and they talk theology. Actually, no, this book is really Calvin and Hobbes fan art, if I'm being honest. I love the comics where they're in the wagon and they're talking about these big philosophical issues, but you have the hilarity of a 6-year-old talking to his stuffed tiger that sort of undercuts that, and it's one of the things I love and tried to bring an homage to in this book. Oh, hey, wait, what exactly are you doing? Oh. Well, when people throw away their kids' crafts from Sunday school, I'm sent to go save them. God has a shelf for them in his living room. It's a big shelf. That comes from direct experience because I've taught Sunday school for like 15 years, and every week I throw out these dear children's little crafts, and I'm like, I'm going to hell. They spent all this time making the little boat, and okay, I'm sorry. Okay, let me try to like wrap this up together just a little bit. And I think if you make art, or you think about making art, one of the temptations when you are attempting to make something that is good and important and worth your time can often be, maybe I should make something about Jesus because it's important and it's significant. And I think most artists carry around this little thing in their mind. And maybe they don't say it out loud, but like maybe it's their own little secret immortality project. Like, what is the thing I'm gonna make that's gonna live forever? I wanna make something great, capital G. And maybe if I attach my work to Jesus, maybe that will help me be great. Maybe God will think I'm great if I make an awesome painting of him. Well, the ghost had some thoughts about this. Oh, that's pretty. Well, I'm afraid you don't know much about art. I have discarded the trivial. Most people will spend their lives entombed in the mundane, but I've decided to only spend my time on the important, works that matter, things that last. Art is not pretty, it's eternal. The artist who builds a masterpiece will live forever. A ticket to immortality, what could be more important? So, do you like it? Oh, it's beautiful. So, I want to suggest a model to you that I hope is useful. I think if you're an artist or think of making anything really in the world, it is better to think of your work more like sandcastles. For instance, if you are a world-class chef, when you make an amazing meal, do you have any expectation that that food will last forever? No, right? The impermanence of it in some way is the point. It's meant to be enjoyed and seen and consumed. And the point of it is also community, right? The meal in some ways is a way to get to the people around the table. So when you think about making sandcastles in your life, do you think about the quality of that sandcastle you made? Probably not. Probably what you remember is someone there with you, right? You probably remember doing it with your dad or with your kids. That the point of that is in many ways, the vehicle of the castle is to build community. And so I think if we think of our art as sandcastles for that purpose, they're made in a particular moment for a particular time for the group of people that gather around it. And they're not designed to last forever. They're just not. This side of the new earth, I know there's a weird thing in Corinthians where it says some of our work is going to make it into the new earth. I don't know what that means. So let's just pretend that doesn't exist. No, again, I think that's possible. I think what he's saying is the works of mankind done in collaboration with God have the God splinter in them, and they will be redeemed, right? But again, let's go back to Mr. Lewis. You've never met an ordinary person. You've never talked to a mere mortal. So the reason why we care about art is not the artifact itself, but for the person who made it, right? The person who made it is the work of art. And so that's why we study art. That's why we care about images of Jesus, right? Because we are people made in the image of God. And as Mr. Tolkien said, we make in the manner in which we were made. Or if you'd like Pastor Yoda to tell it to you in a different way. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Okay, well, let's close there. Thank you very much. Does anyone have a really good question? It's fine if it's a bad question, but oh, yeah.
Do you think of all fine art forms as being visual then, in that sense of like it starts with images that C.S. Lewis quote, like whether it's poetry or music?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in that case, I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't thought of that. Is music visual? I was just talking to a student in my grad program about how annoyed I get when people draw music notes in comics. Because it's like, surely we have some other visual language to describe music besides like floating music notes. And yet, there's no good second option. One of the things Lewis said that I always think about is a phrase he called the discarded image. And it meant that like there was a version of our world 500 years ago that was much more unified in the way that we walked through the world. We saw a universe created, ordered, and shot through with meaning, right? And that image of a universe knit together like buoyed everything that humanity did, right? And we've basically thrown that out and disenchanted our world for a lot of reasons. And you know, if you want to read Charles Taylor's Secular Age, he'll tell you all about that. But I think thinking of imagery as a way to unify our consciousness is kind of more that I'm speaking of, maybe not literal images, but yeah. Okay, thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Actually, when I go to elementary schools, if you have like a bunch of 6-year-olds and you ask them for a question, who has a question? Those of you who teach know immediately what's happened. Every person raises their hand. They have nothing in their brain. If you call on them, they will not have a question. And so again, I've figured out the hack. I say like, who has a really interesting question? And there's just a little delay. They're like, oh, I don't know. Is it interesting? And then anybody who gets up, they definitely have a question. Okay, well, if you see any images of Jesus out in the world that you're interested in, first of all, send them to me. I'm trying to collect, again, for my project when I'm an 85-year-old. But again, I hope over the course of the next week, as you encounter things that ask you to reflect on images of Christ, that you would just notice yourself noticing things. Because this is what visual culture is. It is actually the way our world makes meaning. It's actually everywhere, but we don't see it, right? When we go to a museum and we look at a painting, the museum is asking us to notice that painting. But when we pick up a bubblegum packet, we don't really notice that in the same way that we notice a Degas at a museum because it's got a gilded frame on it. So as you're going through the world, think about that. And also, I auditioned for the Jesus Storybook Bible when I was 25 years old and I didn't get it. And I'm still bitter about it. No, actually, Sally's got a new book coming out about Jesus, which I saw the preview, the proofs of it, and it's really great. It's really awesome. So if you love Jesus Storybook Bible, there's a new book out called Jesus, which Iago also illustrated. So highly recommend. Okay, bye.